Hi everyone, good morning and thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Amy and I'm the Communications Manager here at Morphe. In today's webinar, we're going to be discussing the redundancy process. Before we begin, there are a couple of things I'd like to cover. So first of all, we've got more than 300 people registered for today's webinar. So to keep things sort of manageable, we have got everybody muted. If you are facing difficulties with the webinar though, any audio issues, then just let us know by using the chat box in the GoToWebinar panel. And also in preparation for the live Q&A, please post your questions in the question box as we go through the webinar. We'll answer as many of them as we possibly can at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, we will send you a link to the recording on YouTube, and we will also share a copy of the presentation slides as well. So don't worry if you're not in a position to take notes or you need to leave the webinar early for whatever reason, that's not a problem. We will send you everything at some point later today. In terms of the structure of the webinar today, I will start by just giving you a quick overview of Morphe for those of you who perhaps don't know us, and then I will pass you to our host for today, Michelle Hobson. After the main session, we will come to the live Q&A. So for those of you who aren't a customer of ours, here's a brief overview of Morphe. We've been providing payroll and HR software and managed services for more than 50 years, and we've got more than 10,000 customers from a range of industries all across the UK. Our strapline and our promise is to make payroll and HR easy, and we do that by focusing on 4 key things. So first of all, a simple onboarding. Second, software that's easy to use. Third is rich functionality, and fourth is flexible services, which are delivered by a team of dedicated payroll and HR experts at Morphe. If you would like some more information about our services, please do drop us a note in the question box, and we will of course pick that up after the webinar. Moving on, I'd like to introduce your presenter today, Michelle. She is our HR Technology and Services Director. She joined Morphe in 2017 and is responsible for running all the HR service activities in Morphe. That includes technology, HR and employment law. Michelle has 15 years of both operational and strategic HR experience, and she's CIPD qualified. You can contact Michelle via email, and of course you can find it on LinkedIn on that link there. I'll hand over to Michelle now, who will take you through today's topic, which is managing the redundancy process.
Thank you very much, Amy. And I must apologise before I start, in case anybody hears any banging in the background. We're having some work done on in the house, and this just shows the joys of working from home. So apologies, and do please bear with me. Yeah, there it goes straight away. So coming on to redundancies then, how do you manage the redundancy process? As a bit of a background though, within Morphe, we have seen a really sharp increase in calls from customers relating to redundancies and restructures, and we expect this to continue over the coming months as things start to change, furlough starts to end. And importantly, the Labour Market Outlook Survey, which surveyed 2,000 organisations, said that 33% plan to make some kind of redundancies in the third quarter of this year. And this is actually a 50% increase on the last quarter. And I think there's also important to note that this is more prevalent in the private sector than the public sector. So that kind of gives you the background. We can just go on to the next slide, please. The first thing that we want to talk to you about is the FAIR process, which is at the centre of any redundancy programme. And there's certain key things that you need to follow, and it's really important that you do this. The first one is understanding that a genuine redundancy situation exists and that there is a robust rationale behind this. It's important to always remember that the role is redundant and not the individual. It's very common mistake to start slipping into talking about people being made redundant, but it is actually the role and the work that you're making redundant. And it's important that the employer must consult with its employees. They must follow some form of fair selection procedure, and they must actively consider any alternative employment as a means to avoiding dismissals. Planning and preparation is really important before you start any redundancy process. You need to think about what you need to do, why you need to do it, and have a plan. And the more planning and preparation you do up front, you will find that the process flows a lot more easier. And from an employee and an employer point of view, things will feel easier on both sides. If we just go on to the next slide then, we'll start talking about what that process looks like. The most important thing in a redundancy then is consultation and how you commence this. And you commence consultation by placing employees at risk of redundancy. And this is where you have identified that roles that they are doing may not be required in the future. And the key word that we need to look at here is about entering into meaningful consultation with them. Meaningful consultation is exactly what it sounds like, that it is a true form of consultation where you are informing the individual of the situation, but you are also asking and listening them. And this is something that's really important if you ever got to the point of a tribunal. Just to say a consultation has taken place on paper is not enough. There needs to be evidence that it was a meaningful consultation. You should commence that as soon as is reasonably practical with any situation. I'll go on to some of the specifics shortly. And you must remember that the aim of consultation is to avoid any or all redundancies, and that should be the thought process up front. Furthermore, it's important to remember that the employees are only redundant at the end of the process. So during the process, you still talk to them about being at risk of redundancy, that you are consulting with them, and you are looking at ways to avoid or minimise any job losses. And consulting them, as I said before, really means about asking their opinion as well as informing them. And go on to the next slide, please. So some of the rules that you need to think about with consultation, particularly around collective consultation. And I would always recommend that you seek specific advice at this time from your HR provider, whether that's internal or external. It's very important that this part is got right. There are no set rules for fewer than 20 people, although 4 weeks or a month is always a good guide. As you see on the slide before, it said as soon as is reasonably practical, and 4 weeks does give you that time to have the various meetings. Where you get into a situation where there are more than 20 redundancies, this is where there is legislation about how long you must consult with them for. So if there are between 20 to 99 redundancies within 90 days at one workplace, you must begin consultation at least 30 days before giving that first redundancy notice. If there are 100 or more redundancies within 90 days in one workplace, you must begin a consultation at least 45 days before giving the first redundancy notice. You still need to make sure, as I said before, that you seek specific advice on this, because the nuances around what classes as one workplace can be quite complex. So make sure this is part of your planning and preparation. If you go on to the next slide then, a bit more about collective consultation and how to do it. One thing I will say before I talk about the fair selection is, if you are consulting with a group of people, you need to consult with either a recognised trade union or an employee representative, and you still need to meet with employees individually. In terms of following a fair selection procedure, then, this is about how you decide what you are going to use to choose which of the roles are made redundant, or where people are all, as a number of people doing a similar role, which of those people will remain in roles and which will leave the organisation. And some of the suggestions that we've got in terms of following are absence, lateness, disciplinary record, length of service, performance, and qualifications. Now, the two things that I want to call out is, first of all, about length of service. This used to be quite common, using it as a criteria when we talk, people you might have heard talk about last in, first out. Using that just on its own now is quite rare for a number of reasons, but the most notable reason is about the introduction of age discrimination laws. So it's important to remember that. You can use length of service, but it's advisable to use it where it's being considered alongside other areas. It's also important to exclude from the redundancy scoring any absences which are a result of an employee's disability or pregnancy. When you're using absence, they should be excluded because they are protected by the law and will not be considered part of a fair procedure. If you just go on to the Next slide, please, Amy. One of the other things that's really important when you're looking at this is about the openness and clarity that you need to share with your employees. They need to see as part of a fair process what you are doing, why you are doing it, and if you are using a selection matrix, what that is and how you're scoring it. And that is key to making it a meaningful consultation. The whole thing, though, about a redundancy is about evaluating the work that you are considering either not doing in the future or doing less of, or changing up amongst other people. And in evaluating that work, as I've said before, the key thing to focus on is work, not the individual. It is about the role that they are doing. Even at the beginning of the process, it may seem obvious to you whose job is ending, but you've got to step back and consider the work that still needs to be done, the skills across your workforce, where that will go to help you make any decisions. And where I've said before, if people are doing similar work and you need fewer of them, you have to pool them in order to choose who will stay and who will leave and how much of that work is remaining. But through that consultation, you've got to agree a fair way of evaluating that work and people's skills that sit alongside that to come to that decision as who is selected for redundancy. But having done the preparation, having got a fair selection process, and being able to articulate to your employees what that selection process is and how you will score it, means that at the end of the process, you have got a lot of information that you can give back to them, and you can present it as something that is fair and meaningful. On to the next slide then, please. One of the things that's quite common in a selection process is interviewing for redundancy. And this is still an acceptable way of doing it. You can use this as your selection criteria. Again, you need to be open, honest, and upfront about what you are doing and why you are doing it. But it is worth pulling out some recent case law from June 2020 about Gwynedd Council versus Shelley Barrett. And this provided some clarity on competitive interview process when choosing employees to make redundant. So the claimants argued that they were unfairly dismissed because of failure to provide a right to appeal and the manner in which they were required to apply for their own jobs. Now, the Employment Tribunal actually found that this redundancy process was unfair, but specifically because they had lacked consultation with the teachers, and there was a very strong lack of transparency with the selection and scoring process. So even though the process that they selected was a fair process in the way of interviewing for redundancy, the way they went about it and the fact that they did not communicate up front and consult about how they were going to do this and give the employees the chance to question that, this is what made it unfair. So it's kind of just making sure that you are stepping back. And as always, redundancy processes can be very complex and there are lots of nuances, and there are no two redundancy processes the same. So it's always important that you seek that specialist advice, whether you're a Morphe customer and ring through to us, or whether you have an internal HR department, so that you can step through all the possible scenarios that will put you in the strongest position for when that redundancy process is complete, that you have done something that is not only legal, it is fair, and people feel that they have been fairly treated. Just go on to the next slide then, please. Thinking about alternatives to redundancy, because as I said before about a meaningful consultation, you are actually talking to the employee about ways to avoid redundancy. So on the next slide, we've just got some thoughts around what these are and the types of conversations that you can be having with people. Even before you get to a redundancy situation, layoff and short-time working may be an option that means you have to avoid this, or it may be something that you put in place to either delay or just to see how things go. At the very beginning of COVID, round about March, when it was announced that businesses would be closed and they were starting to see an impact, we saw a real uptick in terms of businesses asking how could they avoid redundancies, what could they do that avoided redundancy. And these two options of layoff and short-time working. So layoff is where no work is offered to an employee during a particular week, and short-term working is where an employee works normally for part of the week, but is laid off for another part of it. The right to lay off employees or put them on short-term working does depend on you having a specific clause in your contract or employee handbook which allows you to do this. A lot of handbooks will have this in, but again, seek advice on whether yours does. If it doesn't, make sure that you get them adjusted so that is in there for the future. I think what we've found with COVID is that things change so quickly, and something that, you know, all of us heard about going on in another country across the other side of the world, slowly starting to creep over here, and then it felt like overnight everything changed. And there was a lot of customers ringing us asking how they could go about it. But as part of a standard Morphe package, we would have that clause in there already. If you don't have that clause in your employment contract, you can potentially get agreements with a union, or there may be cases where you can say there's been custom or practice in your organisation or industry, or you can seek to gain your employees' approval to do this. But I would advise that you look at your contracts now and make sure it's future-proofed. Any changes that you make must be in writing, preferably with a signed agreement from both parties. And I think, as I said before, this was quite commonplace at the beginning of COVID, before furlough was introduced. If we just go on to the next slide. Just to talk about then the pay that for people who are laid off. If an employee is laid off, they are entitled to a statutory guarantee pay of £29 per day, or their daily rate if it's lower. And this payment lasts for 5 days in any 3-month period. Employers can have additional payments if they set it out in their contract of employment, but it is just £29 a day for 5 days in any 3-month period. If employees are laid off for extended periods, then they can make a claim for statutory redundancy payments. So this is not a long-term solution. This is a short-term solution to try and avoid putting in a redundancy situation, and you should treat that as temporary. So now, before I go on to my next section, because we're talking about redundancy payment, I'm actually going to hand over to Chloe Mohammed, who is one of our payroll consultants. She's been with Morphe for just over 4 years and is newly CIPP qualified. So I'm going to hand over to Chloe, who's just going to talk through how statutory redundancy pay is calculated. Over to you, Chloe.
Lovely, thanks, Michelle. Again, apologies, I'm working from home as well, so if there is any background noise, please bear with me. So yeah, the next few slides have been put together more to give you an understanding of the statutory redundancy pay calculations. So employees with more than 2 years service are entitled to start a statutory redundancy pay. There's 2 different types of redundancy pay. So there's the statutory and the contractual redundancy pay. It might be an option for an alternative role to be considered or offered instead of redundancy, and in which case refusal of this role would result in the employee no longer being eligible for redundancy pay. Re-employed employees under the job retention scheme are also not eligible for redundancy pay. Furloughed employees entitled to redundancy it's based on their usual wages, so it wouldn't be based on the furlough rate. And that came in effective on the 31st of July 2020. So holiday pay is still accrued during furlough, and if it's being paid, it must be paid at the usual rate. It wouldn't be based on the furlough rate. If you could pop to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the statutory notice periods, we'll be looking at the employee's entitlements and the number of weeks notice that needs to be given. The number of weeks notice the employer must give an employee varies depending on the length of service. So if the employee has their length of service is between 1 month and 2 years service, you would need to give 1 week's notice at a minimum. If it's between 2 years and 12 years of service, there would be 1 week's notice per year of service. Between 12 years and above, it would be 12 weeks notice, and that's actually capped at 12 weeks at a maximum. So you'd always need to refer to the employment contract. Notice can be more than the above, but it can never be less than the above noted. The employees can also be entitled to pay based on their age. So if the employee is age under 22 years old, the employee would be entitled to 1 week's pay for each year of service within this age bracket. Between 22 years and 40 years old, the employee would then be entitled to 1 week's pay for each year of service, and age 41 and above, the employee would be entitled to 1 week and a half's pay for each year of service within that bracket. The employee's weekly pay is the average they've earned over the 12 weeks before the day they were given their redundancy notice, and the weekly cap for statutory redundancy pay is currently £538. So to give you an example, firstly, this one's quite a straightforward example. So Camilla was made redundant on the 31st of August 2020. She's 21 years old and she's been with the company for 3 years. She's paid weekly and she's paid the same amount each week, and that amounts to £200 per week. So she's entitled to 0.5 weeks pay for each full year, and the calculation breakdown is shown below. So the weekly redundancy amount is £100 and she's entitled to 3 weeks. So that's quite a simple calculation, and it would be £300 total statutory redundancy pay due to the employee for this example. To give you another example, this one would be for an employee that is variable paid. So this employee was made redundant on the 25th of July 2020. She's 60 years old and she's worked with the company for 35 years. As this employee is hourly paid and her hours varied each week, we need to look at the last 12 weekly payments to work out the average. So looking at those 12 weeks below, her total pay was £3,175. So we've calculated an average here of £264.58 a week. She's entitled to 29.5 weeks based on her length of service and her age. So we've calculated the statutory redundancy pay due here as a total of £7,805.11. So that's me done. I'll hand back over to Michelle.
Thank you, Chloe. That was really useful. And I think it's also worth pointing out that there are a number of calculators, particularly on the government website, that are useful when looking at redundancy pay and that can help calculate it for you. So it's always worth having a look at those whilst you're going through it. So I just want to talk a little bit about how the furlough scheme affects redundancy. And I think right at the beginning of COVID, furlough wasn't something that you'd ever heard mentioned, and now it seems to become a very commonplace word in our sort of language at work, and it's something that we will always remember. But the reality is that during furlough, even if organisations have used furlough, that they are starting to think about what this means for them long term. And some businesses are making the decision that they are not going to wait till the end of the furlough scheme and are going to make decisions ahead of that. And it's just important to step back and think about what the implications are for furloughed employees. So it's important that employees should not be selected for redundancy solely because they have been furloughed. Obviously, when people were furloughed, they were furloughed for various different reasons, and we would not recommend that you guarantee that the reason they were furloughed is the same reason that they may be made redundant. So it's to step back and go through that process as you normally would do. If you don't do that and just make someone redundant whilst they were on furlough without going through that formal and fair process, this may give rise to potential discrimination claims or unfair dismissal claims. It's not uncommon for claims to employment tribunals to include challenges. So if you just flip back to the previous slide. Yeah, it's not uncommon for the tribunals to question the fairness of the process. And if you have done that just based on furlough, then there could be kind of a serious implication to that. And it's important that you've gone through that whole piece. At the moment, we are in the second phase of the furlough scheme, which is flexible furlough. And there is a point that potentially means it's arguable that by utilising the job retention scheme, that employers have been able to sort of stave off the need for redundancy while this scheme is in place. It's very difficult for us as HR professionals to predict how employment tribunals are going to view redundancies as a result of COVID. We do not have the foresight of that, and at the moment there is quite a backlog within employment tribunals, so it's unlikely that cases will be heard for some time. What we do recommend, though, is that an employer who fails to give serious consideration to the fact that a redundancy dismissal may be unfair in these circumstances while furlough is available, that may cause a problem. It's not to say that organisations can't, and we spoke to a lot of our customers about that they can't make people redundant whilst the furlough scheme is available, even the flexible furlough scheme. You just have to demonstrate that you have given consideration as to why you cannot continue with that person on furlough and then think about redundancies after it. So that's again where it's really important that you take the time to plan, prepare, speak to an HR professional and be very open and honest. And all you need to do is make sure then that you've got that documented, and then you could replay that back to a tribunal if that time ever came. It just puts you in a much stronger position that you have given that consideration. And I think the overall thing around fairness of redundancy dismissal just depends on the circumstances at the time. So, as I said, it's not necessarily unfair to make a redundancy when furlough's available and is an alternative, but it just has to be all documented and reviewed, and you can play that back as evidence should you need to. And that's one of the really key things when you're doing such a big ER process like a redundancy. You know, we as HR people view it from that end point. What would this look like in employment tribunal? And then work backwards from there in terms of helping you do that. So just flick onto the next slide, please. There's a lot to take in with redundancies, and we've just give you a whistle-stop tour in half an hour, and have certainly only really scratched the surface of the things that you need to consider. But as part of this presentation, this webinar, we've just put in a checklist for you. So if a potential redundancy situation arises, these are the sorts of things that you should consider. First of all, can we avoid redundancy? Is there an alternative to redundancy? Is layoff, short-term working? Is furlough an alternative? And even whilst you're going through the redundancy process and you're consulting with employees, these may be the sorts of questions that come up, maybe the sorts of things you want to consider and make a decision from there. Is there a genuine redundancy situation? Which jobs are going to be affected? And what is that pool for selection? How many jobs are going to be affected and over what period of time? And are these all in one establishment? And that is very important for the collective consultation rules. You need to think about what selection criteria could be used, and do you need to consult collectively, and if so, with whom? Is there a recognised trade union that you need to consult with, or do you need to create an employee consultation group? Then you need to think about the practicalities of when should there be redundancy situations announced, and how should you announce them? It's obviously more difficult at the moment with lots of people working from home. You may need to change it and do it as a Teams or a Zoom call. Maybe it's not practical to get people in an office, particularly with social distancing. So these are all extra things that you need to think about. Then you need to think about what that selection criteria is that you're going to use, how you're going to score it, what that would look like, and who is going to score it. And when you've made these sort of initial decisions, these are all information that you pass on to the employee during the consultation to let them know what's going to happen during the process and to give them the opportunity to ask questions. You need to think about who will hold the individual consultation meetings, when they are going to take place, and again, how they are going to take place, and then who will make that final decision. If there's an appeal process to be had, which there should be as part of any good and solid redundancy process, who will hear that appeal? Think about all the things from start to end that might happen, and this just will make the whole process run a lot more seamlessly, and it will help the employees feel a bit better about what is a difficult time for everyone. When you're going through that process, though, you need to think about what alternative employment is available. are there any other roles in the organisation which those individuals could consider applying for? Even if you have started to recruit externally, take a step back and think, is this an opportunity for someone else, and the chance for them to stay in the organisation? If there is alternative employment and you are able to give it to them, do you want to put a trial period in place? And you can make a decision at the end of that trial period on both bases. That's always something that would be recommended. And then you need to think about the redundancy compensation that be paid. Use those calculators that are online, but get those verified before you confirm to the individuals. It can often be a question that's asked up front, and there's no right or wrong answer at to what point you present somebody with their redundancy figures. If you were doing a process, you might not factor in giving the redundancy figures till the end of the process when you're getting to the point where it looks like they may be made redundant. But don't be worried if someone asks for it up front, just so they understand what all their options are. That's something that can be quite fluid. And then another key thing that you need to think about in advance is when you are giving your employees notice, are you going to ask them to work that notice, or will they be paid in lieu? Have that question answered in your mind, but be prepared to listen to their challenges should they give them. So as I said, lots of things to consider. We've tried to summarise it in a quick checklist there, but make sure that you take that extra advice wherever that is from to help you run this process more smoothly.
Thanks, Michelle. And I'm so sorry about the blip with the slides before. I was clicking. I don't know what was happening.
Don't
nothing
worry.
was happening. I had a nightmare. So hopefully it was still clear for everyone. If not, drop questions into the question box. So yeah, we'll move on to the questions now that you've been adding as we've been going. So the first one from Gemma is the process that we've discussed today, is it the same for people on fixed term contracts?
Yes, it would be the same. You would follow the same process unless their fixed term contract was coming to an end and you were just ending their fixed term contract at a particular date. But if you want to end their fixed term contract earlier, then you would need to go through a similar type of process. But again, it would be really useful to know the detail of what that fixed term contract says, why they are being looked at now, and then you could be given specific advice on it, because there's lots of little things that may impact on it. But if you are looking at bringing someone's fixed term contract forward, at the end date, we would still recommend going through a process similar to redundancies to say why you are bringing that forward. But there may be a question over whether they'd be entitled to any type of payment. They may even be under the 2 years. They're not, but seek specific advice on that.
Yeah, okay. Another question is for consultation. Do you take into account the number of people at risk or the number of roles that are possibly being made redundant when you know whether collective consultation is required? I'm not sure if I've quite made sense there, but was that?
I think I understand the question that you're asking there. So on the slide that we talked about, and when people kind of go back to look at the collective consultation slide, the collective consultation is about the number of redundancies that you are planning on making, not the number of people at risk. So if you plan on putting a team of, say, 20 at risk because they all do similar roles, but you're only planning on making 10 redundant, then you would not have to follow the collective consultation rules. It's not about number of people at risk, it's about the number of redundancies that you are planning on making.
Okay, so then there's another question, similar, in the same vein, I guess. You say the role must be redundant, not the individual. We have a role that we do not need filling at the moment, and the individual is currently furloughed. We will not need to fill the role until probably 6 months' time, but we can't keep paying the salary to the staff member for them to sit at home doing nothing. So we want to make the individual redundant. There is no redeployment possibility. Can we make them redundant?
Even though you're talking about one person, there is still a discussion about a role there. And if it's the role that you don't need doing and it's that one person that does that role, then yes, you can make that role redundant. If you don't intend on recruiting into that, and there should be at least a 6-month period, after you make a role redundant, you should not be recruiting into that until at least 6 months after, because if you did, there would be a case where an employee could argue that you were trying to get rid of them, not the role. I know I'm probably going to keep repeating this quite a bit in the questions, but seek specific advice. But from what I have understood, there is a role that you do not need doing. There is a person who is furloughed who does that role, and by that, just by that fact, the role will be made redundant. It would be that person.
Okay. There's a question asking for the specifics around the number. So I think, Chloe, this was on one of your slides. So we obviously talked about the notice that we were required to give people. Is it someone's asking, is it 12 weeks or is it 3 months? Do we know if is there a specific there?
It's done in weeks.
Okay.
So I believe it would be 12 weeks, but I can, if we can look at that specific question, I can perhaps
I'm
look
pretty
into that
sure
a bit
it is.
further.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is, Chloe.
Yeah.
We can come back and clarify, but because redundancy pay is calculated in weeks rather than months, you have to go off the 12 weeks prior, which may sound like it's a bit more complicated if you pay people monthly, but there is some calculations that you can do to divide that into to weekly pays, and your payroll provider may be able to help you do that. But we can come back to that.
Yeah. Okay. Great. There's one here that I suspect we might need a bit more information because it might be a bit of a tricky one. But someone's asking how you calculate redundancy pay for a worker who works variable hours and was furloughed. Is that one that we might need to go back to someone specifically to get a bit more info?
That would need some more information. Yeah, that's quite a complex one.
Yeah.
What you'd have to find is you'd have to find a way of coming up with their variable pay that didn't disadvantage them from furlough, because if they were only on 80% of their pay, there will have been a way that they worked out what that furlough pay was, and it would probably be using some form of similar formula to work out what that 100% should have been, so that it's all about not disadvantaging someone. Furlough adds an extra layer of complexity to it, but there will be formulas that you can use to work it out to make sure that they still receive, you work out the redundancy calculation on 100%, not 80%, and that's the thing you need to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of.
Yeah, okay. Another question is, if all the employees who are selected for redundancy after applying a fair selection criteria are all furloughed, is this likely to be frowned upon?
Not necessarily, as long as you have followed a process and you have evidenced that process. If it so happens that everyone was furloughed who you've chosen, as long as you can evidence how you got to that point. The point that we were making before is just to ensure that you don't just make someone redundant because they were furloughed, because I think going back to the time when furlough was introduced, it was literally introduced overnight, and people made very rapid and quick decisions about who to furlough and who not to furlough, and allowances were given for that. So I don't think there will be challenges about who was and who was not furloughed, but to apply that same rationale to a redundancy situation would put you in a more risky position. So as long as you have been through that whole process, you have done a fair selection criteria, if at the end of it, it is the people who are on furlough, as long as that's not the reason, you would be okay. It is just all about getting that upfront process right.
Yeah, okay. And then there's a question here around the sort of selection criteria. So if a business is considering redundancy, what would be the situation if a long-standing employee due to retirement age versus an employee with under 2 years of service? So when looking at that case, would the older employee with the longer service retain their job, while the younger employee with under 2 years service automatically be the one chosen for redundancy?
Not necessarily, and I think if you go back to the fair selection criteria slide, I specifically called out that length of service should not be taken on its own. That is quite a risky one because of age discrimination. It is okay to use length of service alongside other things, looking at performance and various other things, but to use that as the only criteria would be a very risky tactic. One of the things that you may wish to consider, which we didn't necessarily cover, but again, it's something that you might want to consider and speak more to an HR professional about, is looking at voluntary redundancies. That's always a potential option when you're going into a redundancy situation, rather than putting a selection criteria in place. And I am, in previous roles when I've worked in HR for previous companies have sort of deployed that tactic where we've announced redundancies, and it can be quite successful because the people who end up leaving are the people who want to leave. What you need, though, in those situations is to have the backup of one. If you have too many people apply for voluntary redundancy, how do you choose between them? Or have the backup if not enough people do. So again, it's something that needs talking through and working through. But going back to the original question, I would certainly not recommend having length of service as the only criteria, making a decision on the less than 2 years versus, you know, someone who's close to retirement has been there for a number of years. The only caveat to that, I suppose, is that people with less than 2 years are not entitled to take a tribunal claim for unfair dismissal, but do remember that they are entitled to take a tribunal claim for discrimination, which could, if they are a young person, potentially lead to an age discrimination claim that will need defending.
Yeah, okay. And we actually had a question is voluntary redundancy recommended? So I think you've covered off that is something that people, you know, businesses can consider. Yeah, they've asked, is it recommended as such? But I think, will it be case by case?
That's very personal to the organisation and the situation that they're in.
Sure.
And kind of, you know, it may be, there are sometimes businesses who say, well, we can't do that because we couldn't afford all the redundancy payments. If it was everybody who'd been here a long time and we're over a certain age and we're entitled to a higher redundancy, there are businesses who just say we can't even look at that. But it is a consideration. I wouldn't say it's recommended one way or the other. If it is something you can do, you tend to find that the process does go a little bit more smoothly because the people who leave at the end of it are people who have volunteered to leave. But it just needs quite a bit more consideration than a kind of a one-word answer.
Yeah, okay. Would it be fair to select based on the outcome of an interview without a selection matrix?
You can do an interview as your form of your selection matrix. That is okay, but you need to have a very open, transparent and clear scoring mechanism for that interview process. So if you are going to use an interview as a way to decide, you need to be able to show the employees before they apply what sort of areas you'll be looking at and what sort of scoring mechanisms you'd come through. If you think back to that case I talked about, the reason that the council fell foul with their selection process of interviews was because they didn't consult and they weren't clear and open about what the outcome of the interview was. And even if they did have something that was clear, they weren't able to evidence it, and it is all about the evidence. So in the same way that you'd have a selection matrix that you might do as the paper-based exercise, the interview process is some form of selection matrix. It's just more of a live process, but you'd still need to evidence each of the areas that we are looking at, the competencies you were looking at, and how you were looking at scoring them and why you scored them like that. And that is the key to whether it's interviews or a paper-based selection exercise.
Yeah, okay. One last question, and then I think it's going to be time to wrap the webinar up. But someone's asked, if I create a part-time role instead of a full-time role, is that classed as redundancy?
If you are doing that for reasons of that you need to save money and cost efficiencies, and you want to make a role part-time, and potentially there is not enough work there to do it, that would be a redundancy situation. Again, seek more advice on the specifics, because there may be things that obviously I've not got from that question. But my initial thought is that, you know, if you've got someone doing a full-time role and say for ease they're going down to half an FTE, it wouldn't be reasonable to expect that person to accept those changes without question. So you would likely be in a redundancy situation, but do seek advice on that one.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all your questions, everyone, and thank you so much to Chloe and Michelle for answering them as well. So to wrap things up, I just want to point you in the direction of the Morphe Knowledge Centre. It's on our website and you can navigate it to it from the top menu bar. There's so much information on there. You know, all of our experts over the years have just been adding to it. So there's blog posts, there's guides, we've got all of our previous webinar recordings on there. It's all free. Just you can search around, you can use the bar to find specific topics. It is really useful. We've also got an employment law and HR legislation guide in the resources section, which we regularly update, so that should come in handy as well. Apologies, that's the fire alarm going off, so I'm definitely going to wrap up now. I hope you found today's webinar useful. I will send you the slides and the recording at some point today, and a big thank you to Michelle again and to Chloe for hosting and answering everyone's questions. I will wrap up there. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.